Elijah Bennett sat behind the wheel of his weathered SUV. The dry Arizona heat radiating through the windshield. The air outside shimmered, distorting the world into fleeting waves of illusion. Before him stood Gold Line Autos, the crown jewel of luxury car dealerships. Its facade sleek, glassy, and unapologetically modern. To the untrained eye, this was a monument to aspiration. But to Elijah, it was a stage one where roles would be assumed, expectations performed, and truths exposed. He killed the engine, took a breath, and stepped out. His attire was deliberately unremarkable. A gray hoodie faded from years of washing, jeans frayed at the edges, and sneakers with soles that had seen better days. He tugged the hood over his head, not to conceal but to reveal, to draw out what lay dormant in the everyday. As he approached the glass doors, the faint hum of air conditioning and muted conversation spilled out. Elijah held them open for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes scanning the interior. The polished floor gleamed like a promise unfulfilled. A lineup of luxury vehicles, sleek coupes, towering SUVs, and convertibles made to devour open roads stood as silent witnesses to a performance yet to unfold. Inside, the rhythm changed, conversation stilled, laughter hushed. A few glances were cast his way, not long enough to be overt, but deliberate enough to be felt. Elijah had walked into this before. In stores, restaurants, even on sidewalks. It was the choreography of casual bias, the subtle shift of posture, the reflexive narrowing of eyes, the barely perceptible hesitation before an artificial smile. Elijah approached the nearest vehicle, a gleaming silver coupe, its curves designed for admiration. He let his fingers graze the handle. He wasn't inspecting it, not really. He was waiting. The seconds stretched, and then, there it was. The unmistakable click of heels against tile. Brisk and purposeful. "Excuse me," came the voice, clipped and professional. Elijah turned slowly to meet the gaze of a middle-aged woman in a tailored suit. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, darted briefly to his hoodie before settling into a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" "I'm just looking around," Elijah said, his tone measured, his words devoid of pretense. The woman's smile held, but only barely. "Of course," she said. "Are you looking for something specific?" Elijah gestured vaguely at the cars. "Just browsing." Her gaze lingered, assessing. "Well," she said, stepping closer, her clipboard held like a shield, "we cater to a particular clientele. Most of our vehicles require pre-qualification." The words hung in the air, innocuous in their phrasing yet loaded with a silent accusation. Elijah met her gaze without flinching. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice low, almost casual. Her expression tightened. "It's just policy," she said. "We like to ensure our customers find options within their range. If you'd like, I can recommend." A voice interrupted from across the showroom. "Amelia, the delivery truck is here." She glanced away, her focus momentarily broken. When her eyes returned to Elijah, they carried a sharper edge, a quiet warning. He gave her a faint smile, one she didn't return. The exchange was over for now, but the tension lingered. It wasn't hostility, not outright. It was something subtler, more insidious. It was the kind of scrutiny that asked questions without words. "What are you doing here? Do you belong? Why don't you look the part?" Elijah moved further into the showroom, deliberately slow, his hands in his pockets. He stopped by another car, a black SUV with rims that shimmered like molten silver. Again, his fingers brushed the door handle. And again, he waited. Around him, the low hum of conversation resumed, though he caught fragments, whispered words, stifled laughter. He didn't need to hear them clearly. He already knew what they were about. There was nothing remarkable about the SUV or the coupe or any other vehicle here. Not really. What made them remarkable was the story this place told about them and about the people who could own them. Wealth here was a costume, and Elijah had arrived deliberately out of costume. It wasn't a matter of deception but of revelation. He wanted to see what this place would show him when it thought he wasn't watching. As the afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor, Elijah felt the quiet weight of every glance, every hushed word, every assumption. It wasn't anger he felt, not yet. It was something colder, something heavier, the steady, unrelenting burden of being made to prove oneself, over and over, to those who had already decided the answer. And so, as he stood among the gleaming vehicles and polished floors. Elijah waited not for permission, not for approval, but for the truth to reveal itself. And he knew it would. It always did. The cool air inside Goldline Autos seemed to sharpen the divide between Elijah Bennett and the space around him. The luxury dealership was crafted to dazzle, but beneath its gleaming surface lay something unspoken, something far less polished. As Elijah moved through the showroom, he felt the tension grow, not an outright rejection, but the quiet, persistent questioning of his presence. It wasn't just the stairs, though they were there, following him like shadows. It was the way the space itself seemed to resist him, its polished tiles reflecting everything except welcome. He paused by another car, a crimson sedan whose sleek lines seemed designed to exude power. Elijah wasn't admiring it, he was studying the reflection in its surface, the distorted movements of staff members who stole glances in his direction. Each glance carried its own weight, a subtle calculus of judgment, hesitation, and quiet dismissal. From behind, the now familiar sound of heels clicked against the floor, drawing closer with every step. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. "Sir," came Amelia's voice, sharper now, though she struggled to mask it with professionalism. "I'm afraid I'll have to ask you not to touch the vehicles." Elijah turned slowly, his expression calm but unreadable. "I wasn't planning to," he said, his voice measured, almost conversational. Amelia's clipboard was clutched tightly against her chest, her polished nails tapping against its edge. "These cars," she began, choosing her words carefully, "are valued at a price point that typically requires pre-qualification. If you're serious about exploring your options, I'd be happy to connect you with one of our sales consultants." Elijah tilted his head slightly, as though considering her offer. "And what if I'm just browsing?" Her smile tightened, revealing a sliver of impatience. "We find that most of our clientele prefer a more tailored experience." "And by most of your clientele," Elijah said, his tone light yet pointed, "what exactly do you mean?" For a moment, her facade slipped. The question had landed where it was meant to, unsettling her carefully constructed authority. But Amelia recovered quickly, her posture stiffening. "I'm simply suggesting that we match you with options that align with your circumstances." Elijah's eyes didn't waver. He wasn't angry, not yet. But there was a quiet intensity in his gaze, one that seemed to make Amelia shift her weight ever so slightly. "Circumstances," he repeated, the word hanging between them like a challenge. The showroom felt smaller now, the glossy cars and pristine floors closing in. Around them, staff members pretended to go about their tasks, but their movements were slower, their attention unmistakably drawn to the unfolding exchange. This, Elijah knew, was the real test, not the words being spoken, but the silence that surrounded them. It was the silence of complicity, of people who chose not to intervene. Not because they didn't see, but because they didn't want to see. Amelia cleared her throat, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the tension beneath. "If you'd like," she said, her voice growing brisk, "I can prepare a list of vehicles that might be more suitable." Elijah let the words settle, then offered a faint smile. "Sure," he said, his tone even. "Let's see what you've got." She hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though unsure whether he was mocking her. But she nodded, turning on her heel and walking briskly toward her desk. The sound of her heels faded, leaving Elijah standing alone in the center of the room, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like the desert heat outside. He turned back to the crimson sedan, his reflection still distorted in its surface. He thought about the way assumptions operated, how they slipped into every corner of a moment without ever announcing themselves. They didn't need to. Their power lay in their subtlety, in their ability to shape interactions without the need for confrontation. When Amelia returned, her movements were clipped, her expression forced into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She handed him a printout, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. "Here are a few options," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "These models are reliable, economical, and practical." Elijah unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the list. The cars were modest, every one of them far removed from the high-end luxury vehicles on display. Used sedans, compact hybrids, an older SUV. His lips twitched in faint amusement, though he quickly hid it. "Appreciate the effort," he said, folding the paper and tucking it into his pocket. "You've given me a lot to think about." Amelia's shoulders relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained wary. "Of course," she said, "if you have any questions." "I do," Elijah interrupted, his tone calm but unmistakably firm. "What makes you think I'm not qualified to be here?" The question froze her in place. Her carefully curated professionalism faltered. And for a moment, the mask slipped entirely. But then, just as quickly, it was back. "I'm not suggesting anything of the sort," she said, though her words felt hollow. Elijah didn't respond. He simply held her gaze, his silence louder than any argument. The tension between them was palpable. A quiet battle being waged without raised voices or overt accusations. Around them, the showroom remained still, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on every corner. Finally, Amelia spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to save you time." Elijah nodded slowly, as though considering her words. "Time's a funny thing," he said, his voice thoughtful. "It always shows you what you need to see." And with that, he turned away, leaving her standing there with her clipboard and her carefully constructed assumptions. As he moved further into the showroom, he could feel the eyes on his back, the unspoken questions lingering in the air. This wasn't new to him. It never was. But that didn't make it any less heavy. For Elijah, the day was just beginning. The challenge wasn't the cars or the showroom or even Amelia. The challenge was the silent architecture of bias. The way it built itself into the foundation of every interaction, shaping lives without ever revealing its blueprint. And Elijah was here to tear that blueprint apart. Blank. Blank. Elijah Bennett remained a calm figure amid the polished chaos of Goldline Autos. Yet the air around him had changed. The room buzzed faintly, not with activity but with the quiet hum of unease. Conversations that had resumed after his arrival slowed again as staff members stole glances in his direction. Their whispers were as subtle as they were piercing. Words exchanged under breaths but loud enough in their intent. Elijah stood by a sleek black SUV, his hands resting in his pockets, his posture relaxed but unyielding. He wasn't simply browsing, he was watching. Every movement, every expression told him more about this place than its glossy advertising ever could. And just as he anticipated, the next act in this silent drama was about to unfold. "Sir," a voice interrupted, and Elijah turned to find a younger salesman approaching. The man's expression was strained, a smile stretched so tight it seemed ready to snap. His name tag read Travis, though his demeanor spoke less of eagerness and more of reluctance. "Can I help you find something?" Travis asked, his tone polished but uneasy. Elijah studied him for a moment, letting the silence stretch just enough to make the man shift on his feet. "I'm fine, thank you," Elijah said, his voice calm, measured. "Just looking." Travis nodded, his eyes darting briefly to Amelia, who stood across the room. She gave a curt nod in return, her body rigid, her clipboard clutched tightly as if bracing herself. Elijah caught the silent exchange, the way her eyes urged Travis to handle the situation without creating a scene. "Sure," Travis said, clearing his throat. "It's just, if you're interested in a test drive or anything. We typically—" Elijah cut him off with a raised hand. "Typically what?" Travis hesitated, his polished script faltering. "Typically, we schedule appointments in advance for high-demand vehicles," he finished weakly, his words more question than statement. Elijah nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Good to know, but I'm not here for a test drive. Just exploring my options." The salesman's relief was visible, though it did little to mask his discomfort. He gave another strained smile and backed away, leaving Elijah once again in the company of the cars and the stairs. Blank. The next interruption was less subtle. A security guard, older and broad-shouldered, approached from the far end of the showroom. His presence was an unmistakable escalation, his uniform a declaration of authority. He didn't look at Elijah directly at first, instead making a show of surveying the room as if on routine patrol. But his path was deliberate, his steps measured, and soon enough, he was standing just close enough to be felt. "Afternoon," the guard said, his voice firm but not unfriendly. "Is everything all right here?" Elijah turned to him, his face unreadable. "It is," he replied. "Why wouldn't it be?" The guard hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "No reason," he said quickly, though his presence suggested otherwise. "Just checking in, making sure our guests are comfortable." Elijah's lips twitched, A faint shadow of a smile. "That's thoughtful of you. I'm quite comfortable." The guard nodded, but his eyes lingered on Elijah's hoodie and sneakers, the faintest flicker of doubt crossing his face before he stepped away. The exchange, though brief, carried the weight of its intent. Elijah could feel it, the unspoken suspicion, the quiet assumption that his presence here was somehow out of place. Blank. Blank. Amelia reappeared, her clipped stride betraying her mounting frustration. She stopped a few feet away, her polished heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. "Sir," she began, her voice carefully controlled, "I see you've been looking around for a while now. If there's something specific you'd like to discuss, I'd be happy to connect you with one of our senior consultants." Elijah turned to her, his calm gaze meeting hers. "And what makes a senior consultant different from the others?" Amelia blinked, caught off guard. "They're better equipped to handle high-value transactions," she said carefully. Elijah tilted his head, the faintest hint of amusement flickering in his eyes. "High-value transactions. I see." Amelia's grip on her clipboard tightened. "I'm simply trying to provide the best experience for our customers," she said, her tone growing defensive. "We value professionalism here." Elijah let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "And how do you determine who gets the best experience?" Amelia's face flushed, and for the first time, her composure visibly cracked. "I don't understand what you mean," she said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Don't you?" Elijah asked, his voice still calm but unmistakably firm. "Because from where I'm standing, it seems like some people are given the benefit of the doubt, while others are questioned." The tension in the room thickened, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on everyone present. Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Around them, staff members paused in their tasks, their attention drawn to the quiet confrontation. Elijah waited a beat longer, then stepped back, his hands in his pockets. "Take your time," he said, his tone light but pointed. "I'm not in a rush." Amelia stared after him as he turned away, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. The room felt colder now, the air heavy with the unspoken. Elijah moved to another vehicle, his steps unhurried, his presence unyielding. He wasn't here to cause a scene. He didn't need to. The truth was already doing that for him. The hum of Goldline autos carried a different weight now, a thick, unspoken tension that hung in the air. Elijah Bennett could feel it with every step he took. The more he lingered, the more the room seemed to resist him, not with open hostility, but with a quiet, insidious pushback that came in glances, in hushed whispers, in the way people carefully adjusted their positions, as though creating space where none was needed. It wasn't new to him. It never was, but the familiarity didn't dull the sting. Elijah approached the gleaming hood of a black coupe, its surface a mirror to his figure. Distorted and faint, he ran his fingers just above the edge, not quite touching, but close enough to draw notice. He didn't have to look over his shoulder to know someone was watching. The sharp click of Amelia's heels behind him confirmed it. "Sir," she began, her voice losing the last vestiges of politeness. "As I mentioned earlier, we prefer customers not handle the vehicles unless accompanied by a consultant." Elijah turned to her, his hands resting lightly in his pockets. "I wasn't handling it," he said simply. His voice was calm, but there was something in his tone, a quiet, unshakable authority that made her pause. Her clipboard was back, clasped tightly in her hands as though it might offer protection. "I understand," she said, though her expression suggested the opposite. "But I have to maintain the integrity of our showroom." "And I'm compromising that integrity?" Elijah asked, raising an eyebrow. The question was soft, but its impact was sharp, cutting through the rehearsed professionalism in her tone. Amelia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not intentionally," she replied, but her words stumbled under the weight of their implications. "I just need to ensure that our policies are followed." "Policies," Elijah repeated, letting the word roll off his tongue. "Interesting how policies always seem to apply differently, depending on who's standing in front of you." Her face flushed slightly, the veneer of control slipping for the briefest of moments. "That's not what I—" Before she could finish, a new voice entered the fray, light and casual but carrying its own undertone of authority. "Is there a problem here?" Elijah turned to see a man in his late 30s. His suit perfectly tailored, his smile carefully curated, his name tag read Michael. He wasn't a salesman, He was a manager one rank below Amelia but cut from the same cloth. No problem, Elijah said, his tone neutral. Just exploring my options. Michael's smile widened, though it didn't reach his eyes. Of course, he said, stepping closer. We're happy to assist. Amelia, why don't you let me take over? Amelia hesitated, her grip tightening on her clipboard. But she nodded and stepped back, her heels clicking sharply as she retreated. Michael turned his attention fully to Elijah, his expression slipping into something resembling genuine interest. So, he began, gesturing toward the row of vehicles. What kind of car are you looking for? Something sporty? Family-friendly? Maybe something practical? The last word lingered in the air, heavy with suggestion. Elijah met his gaze evenly. What makes you think I'm looking for practical? Michael's smile faltered, but only briefly. Just a guess, he said smoothly. Most of our customers appreciate tailored recommendations. Tailored to what? Elijah asked, his tone sharp enough to draw a flicker of discomfort across Michael's face. Michael recovered quickly, brushing off the question with a light chuckle. You know, lifestyle, needs, budget. Elijah repeated, his voice steady. You've got that figured out just by looking at me? Michael's smile grew tighter. I didn't mean anything by it. Just trying to help. Elijah let the silence stretch, watching as Michael shifted slightly under his gaze. Around them, the hum of the showroom grew quieter, the tension rippling outward like a wave. Employees moved more slowly now, their glances more frequent, their conversations more hushed. I appreciate the help, Elijah said finally, his voice calm but unyielding. But I'd like to see what I came here for without any assumptions. Michael opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Elijah turned back toward the cars, effectively ending the conversation. Michael stood frozen for a moment, then stepped away, his polished shoes clicking against the tile. Blank. Elijah made his way toward the back of the showroom, where the most exclusive vehicles were displayed under soft, flattering lights. The space was quieter here, almost reverent, but as he approached a silver convertible, a faint murmur of voices reached his ears. Doesn't he know where he is? One voice whispered, sharp and incredulous. Probably just here to look. Another replied, the words dripping with derision. You know how it is. Elijah didn't need to turn to know who was speaking. The voices were familiar, not in their specifics but in their tone, the tone of people who believed themselves unseen. Their judgments safe in the shadows of casual conversation. He stood by the convertible, his reflection sharp and clear in its polished surface. The voices faded as their owners moved away, but their words lingered, embedding themselves in the fabric of the moment. Blank. When Elijah finally turned back toward the main showroom, he noticed Amelia and Michael conferring in hushed tones by the front desk. Their eyes darted toward him briefly before returning to each other, their expressions strained. Elijah stopped in the middle of the room, his hands still in his pockets, his posture unyielding. He let his gaze sweep the space, taking in the stares, the whispers, the quiet choreography of discomfort that had unfolded around him since he arrived. The weight of it pressed down on him, but he didn't falter. He had come here for a reason, and this was exactly what he had expected. The cars, the showroom, the policies, all of it was secondary. What he was witnessing, what he was uncovering, was far more valuable than any vehicle on display. He wasn't just a customer here. He was a mirror, reflecting the biases, the assumptions, the quiet injustices that shaped this place and so many others like it. And he knew that reflection was uncomfortable. But that was the point. This wasn't about him. It never had been. It was about the walls people built, the invisible barriers that separated us from them, that decided who belonged and who didn't. And Elijah Bennett had every intention of tearing those walls down, one moment at a time. The atmosphere at Goldline Autos had shifted again, moving from tense unease to something more brittle, a crackling energy that seemed ready to shatter at any moment. Elijah Bennett remained calm in the face of it all, his every step a quiet defiance. He wasn't loud, but his presence was undeniable, a mirror held up to a system that thrived on avoiding its own reflection. He stood near a white convertible now, a car so pristine it seemed almost untouched by human hands. The soft hum of the showroom's air conditioning filled the silence, punctuated only by the faint rustle of papers and the occasional murmur of voices. Elijah traced the edge of the car's body with his eyes. not touching, not daring to give anyone more ammunition for their assumptions. He didn't need to look up to feel the eyes on him. They were everywhere, furtive glances from staff, open stares from other customers. It was the kind of attention that spoke volumes without saying a word. Elijah had long since learned to read it, to understand the coded language of judgment and dismissal. It was a language he hadn't chosen but had been forced to master. Blank. Blank. Excuse me, sir, came a voice from his left. It was Michael, the manager from earlier, his polished demeanor now tinged with something more direct. I'm afraid I'll need to ask you to step away from the vehicle. Elijah turned slowly, meeting Michael's gaze with an expression of calm curiosity. Step away? He repeated, his tone measured. Why? Michael hesitated, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. It's just policy, he said, his voice faltering slightly. For the protection of the vehicles. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Policy, he said, letting the word linger. Interesting how it keeps coming up. Michael cleared his throat, his composure slipping. We apply it to everyone. Sir, he said quickly, though the words felt rehearsed. Hollow. I'm sure you understand. Elijah tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. Do you? The question hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. Around them, the showroom seemed to hold its breath. Michael shifted his weight, his polished shoes scuffing against the tile. I'm just trying to ensure everything runs smoothly, he said finally, his voice defensive. Elijah's lips twitched into a faint smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. Smoothly for who? He asked, his voice soft but cutting. For me, or for you? Blank. Blank. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Amelia appeared, her face tight with barely concealed irritation. Is there a problem here? She asked, her voice sharp. Michael glanced at her, relief flickering across his face. No problem, he said quickly, just clarifying some policies. Amelia's eyes flicked to Elijah, her expression hardening. Mr. Bennett, she began, her tone clipped. If you're interested in purchasing a vehicle, I'd be happy to connect you with our financing team. Otherwise what? Elijah interrupted, his voice still calm, though there was an unmistakable edge to it now. Amelia hesitated, her jaw tightening. Otherwise, we'll have to ask you to leave, she said finally, her words landing with the weight of a challenge. Elijah stood still, his hands in his pockets, his gaze locked on hers. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. That demanded to be broken but dared no one to speak. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice quiet but firm. And why is that? Amelia's composure cracked, just slightly, as if said, we have policies. Policies, Elijah repeated, cutting her off. I've heard about your policies. But what I haven't heard is why they only seem to apply to me. Amelia flushed, her grip tightening on her clipboard. That's not true, she said quickly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. It's not? Elijah asked, his tone almost conversational. Because I've been here long enough to notice how things work. And it's clear I'm not being treated the same as everyone else. Amelia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Michael shifted uncomfortably beside her, his polished confidence replaced by unease. Around them, staff and customers alike pretended not to listen, though their attention was unmistakably fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Blank. The tension broke with the sudden chime of the front door's opening. A sharply dressed man in his early 40s entered, his navy suit impeccably tailored. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the room before landing on Elijah. Mr. Bennett, the man said, his voice warm but firm. He extended a hand as he approached. I'm Alex Harrington, the regional director. It's a pleasure to finally meet you. Elijah turned to him, his expression calm but unreadable. He shook Alex's hand, his grip firm. Likewise, he said simply. Amelia and Michael froze, their expressions shifting from confusion to alarm. Alex glanced at them, his polite smile slipping into something sharper. Amelia, Michael, he said, his tone suddenly curt. I trust you've been taking care of Mr. Bennett? Neither of them responded, their silence more telling than any words could have been. Alex's gaze hardened. I see, he said, his voice cold. Elijah watched the exchange with quiet interest, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He didn't need to say anything. The truth was already speaking for itself. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As Alex led Elijah toward the conference room for a private conversation. The weight of what had just transpired hung heavily in the air. The staff and customers left behind exchanged hushed whispers, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Elijah didn't look back. He didn't need to. The walls of Goldline Autos, built on the unspoken rules of bias and exclusion, were beginning to crack, and Elijah Bennett was more than ready to bring them down. The conference room was a sanctuary of sleek design glass walls that offered no secrets. A long table that reflected the soft overhead lighting, and chairs that seemed more sculptural than functional. Yet, for all its modernity, the room felt heavy, its air thick with the weight of what was unspoken. Elijah Bennett entered with deliberate steps, his presence commanding yet unassuming. Behind him trailed Alex Harrington, the regional director, his polished confidence now tempered with the realization that this meeting was about far more than business. Amelia and Michael followed reluctantly, their expressions taut with a mixture of apprehension and guilt. The tension between them was palpable, like a thread stretched too thin, ready to snap. Elijah took his seat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but unyielding. Alex stood near the glass wall, his hands clasped in front of him, while Amelia and Michael settled stiffly at the opposite end of the table, their unease evident in every glance, every fidget. The silence stretched, its presence as loud as any argument. Elijah let it linger, his gaze sweeping across the room, taking in every detail. The way Amelia gripped her clipboard as if it might shield her. The way Michael's fingers drummed nervously against the table. The way Alex avoided meeting anyone's eyes. Finally, Elijah spoke, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "It seems," he began, "that we've found ourselves at a crossroads." Amelia shifted in her seat, her discomfort visible. "Mr. Bennett," she began, her tone measured, "I want to apologize if..." Elijah interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "Let's not deal in hypotheticals. Ms. Grant, you and I both know what happened here today." Amelia's mouth opened, then closed again, her confidence faltering under the weight of his gaze. Michael glanced at her, as if seeking guidance, but found none. Elijah turned his attention to Alex, his expression steady. "And you, Mr. Harrington, I'm curious, when you walked in, what did you see?" Alex hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I saw..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I saw a situation that required my attention." Elijah's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "Diplomatic," he said, "but not what I asked." "What did you see?" Alex swallowed, his discomfort visible. "I saw my staff failing to meet the standards of professionalism I expect." Elijah nodded slowly, leaning back in his chair. "And why do you think that happened?" The question hung in the air, its weight pressing down on everyone in the room. Alex glanced at Amelia and Michael, then back at Elijah. "Bias," he said finally, the word landing like a stone in the still water of the conversation. Conscious or unconscious, it was bias. Elijah's gaze softened slightly, though his voice remained firm. "Bias," he repeated, such a small word for something so pervasive, so destructive. He let the words linger before continuing. "Bias is what made Ms. Grant assume I couldn't possibly be here to buy one of your luxury cars. Bias is what brought Mr. Michael over to handle the situation. Bias is what made your security guard shadow me like a thief." Amelia flinched, the truth of his words cutting deeper than any reprimand. Michael looked down at his hands, his confidence crumbling under the weight of his complicity. "This," Elijah said, gesturing around the room, "isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever walked into this showroom and been made to feel like they didn't belong. It's about the culture you've cultivated here, one that rewards appearances over character. Assumptions over inquiry." He turned to Alex, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "And it's about what you're going to do to change it." Alex straightened, his jaw tightening. "Mr. Bennett, I want to assure you." "I don't want assurances," Elijah interrupted, his tone sharp. "I want action." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a shroud. Elijah let the moment stretch, his gaze moving between them, ensuring the gravity of the situation was fully understood. Finally, Alex spoke, his voice steady but humbled. You're right, he said. We failed you today. And not just you, every customer who's ever been judged unfairly. Every employee who's ever felt the pressure of a culture that values bias over integrity. He turned to Amelia and Michael, his expression hardening. This stops now. We'll be implementing new training protocols. Not just for our staff but for our leadership as well. Every employee will undergo unconscious bias training. And we'll be revisiting our policies to ensure they reflect the values we claim to uphold. Amelia nodded, her expression resolute despite her earlier discomfort. I understand, she said quietly, and I'll do everything I can to make things right. Michael followed suit, his voice low but sincere. Me too, I was wrong, and I need to do better. Elijah studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he nodded. Words are a start, he said, but change requires more than promises. It requires accountability. He stood, his presence filling the room. You have an opportunity here, he said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. To create something better. To build a culture that values every person who walks through those doors. Regardless of how they look or what you assume about them. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. Glancing back at Alex. Make sure it happens, he said simply. Alex nodded, his expression one of quiet determination. We will, he said. Elijah left the room, his steps steady, his resolve unshaken. The glass walls reflected his figure as he walked away. A lone man in a space that had tried to define him but had instead been redefined by his presence. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The glass doors of Goldline Autos swung shut behind Elijah Bennett. But the weight of the day didn't leave him. The Arizona sun blazed overhead, its light stark and unrelenting, casting sharp shadows on the pavement. Elijah paused by his modest SUV, the heat radiating from the asphalt beneath his feet. He stood still for a moment, letting the silence of the outside world press against him, a contrast to the charged air he had left behind. The tension of the afternoon had followed him, clinging like a second skin. Each interaction inside the dealership had been a trial. Every subtle glance, every carefully phrased remark a reminder of the unspoken rules that govern spaces like these. Rules that weren't written in any handbook but lived in the hearts and minds of those who upheld them. Elijah opened his car door but didn't climb in. Instead, he leaned against the frame, his gaze drifting back to the gleaming facade of Goldline Autos. The building stood as a monument to exclusivity, its glass walls reflecting a world that valued surface over substance, perception over truth. For all its polish, it was a place where people like him were seen as out of place, where presence was questioned before purpose could be understood. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Inside, the ripple effects of Elijah's presence were still unfolding. Amelia Grant sat stiffly at her desk, her hands gripping the edge as though to steady herself. Her mind raced, replaying the events of the day with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. She had built her career on control, on maintaining an image of authority and professionalism. But Elijah had unraveled that image with nothing more than quiet persistence. Across the room, Michael lingered near the front desk, his usual confidence replaced by unease. He avoided meeting the eyes of his colleagues, aware of their whispers, their subtle glances. He could feel their judgment as clearly as he had felt Elijah's. For the first time, he wondered if the discomfort he felt now was a fraction of what others experienced every day in spaces like this one. Alex Harrington remained in the conference room, his gaze fixed on the glass walls as if searching for answers in the reflections. He prided himself on his leadership, on running a region that embodied the values of excellence and inclusion. Yet, the events of the day had laid bare the gaps in that vision. The cracks in the foundation he had thought was so solid. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As Elijah stood outside, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen before answering. The voice on the other end was familiar. Warm and steady. How did it go? The voice asked. Elijah smiled faintly, though the weight in his chest didn't lift. About how I expected, he said. A lot of resistance, a lot of deflection, and, in progress. Elijah replied, his voice firm, slow, but real. The person on the other end chuckled softly. That's the only kind that sticks. Elijah nodded, though no one could see it. It's just, he trailed off, searching for the right words. You can't help but wonder how many more places are like this. How many more people are walking into rooms where they're already seen as less? The voice on the line grew quiet for a moment, then said, "One at a time, Elijah. That's how you change it. One room, one conversation, one truth at a time." Elijah exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "One at a time," he repeated. Blank. Underscore, blank. Back inside the dealership, the cracks in the day's facade were becoming harder to ignore. Staff members gathered in small clusters, their conversations low and cautious. The unspoken hierarchy of the showroom had been disrupted, its foundations shaken by the weight of what Elijah had exposed. Amelia found herself alone at her desk, staring at a list of customer inquiries she couldn't focus on. She thought about the assumptions she had made, the snap judgments that had shaped her every interaction with Elijah. She thought about the way he had met her gaze, not with anger but with something more unsettling: understanding. He had seen through her, through all of them, and held up a mirror none of them had wanted to face. Michael, meanwhile, retreated to the break room, his hands trembling as he poured himself a cup of coffee. The silence of the room was oppressive, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator. He thought about the way he had stepped in, not to help but to contain. He thought about the way Elijah had looked at him, not with contempt but with disappointment. It was a look that would stay with him long after the day ended. Blank. Underscore, blank. Elijah finally climbed into his SUV, the heat inside stifling even with the windows cracked. He started the engine, the air conditioning kicking on with a low hum. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Goldline autos grow smaller in the distance. He thought about the conversation still happening inside, the shifts that had been set in motion. He thought about the faces of Amelia and Michael, the way they had faltered, the way their carefully constructed facades had cracked under the weight of their own biases. And he thought about the larger picture, the countless spaces like this one where the unspoken rules of exclusion still reigned. He knew the road ahead would be long, filled with more rooms, more glances, more resistance, but he also knew the importance of every step, every small victory in a world that so often resisted change. As he drove, the Arizona sun began to set, casting the horizon in hues of gold and orange. The day was ending, but the work was just beginning. And Elijah Bennett, steady and unshaken, was ready to meet it head-on. The next morning, Goldline Autos opened its doors to the same bright Arizona sun that had witnessed the events of the day before. But inside, the air was different. The polished floors, gleaming vehicles, and carefully curated atmosphere seemed to reflect more than just light. They carried the weight of yesterday's revelations. The cracks in the dealership's facade had been revealed. And now, everyone who stepped inside was walking on ground that felt uncertain, unsteady. For Elijah Bennett, the day wasn't over when he left the lot. Change, he knew, wasn't born in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It was nurtured in the quiet moments after, in the spaces where reflection could take root. And for the staff of Goldline Autos, those moments were unfolding. Blank. Underscore, blank. Amelia Grant sat at her desk that morning, her clipboard untouched for the first time in years. The usual rhythm of her day: organizing sales leads, managing schedules, maintaining the dealership's pristine image, felt hollow. Elijah's words echoed in her mind, each one dismantling the certainties she had built her career upon. She thought about her assumptions, about the way she had judged Elijah before he even spoke. She had seen his hoodie and sneakers, his calm demeanor, and decided he didn't belong. It wasn't an explicit thought, nothing she could have named in the moment. But it had shaped her actions, her tone, her every word. Now, she felt the weight of those choices. Not because she had been called out, but because she had finally been forced to see herself. And what she saw was someone she didn't recognize. Blank. Underscore, blank. Michael sat in his car in the parking lot, the morning sun streaming through the windshield. His hands rested on the steering wheel, his knuckles white from the pressure. He had spent the night replaying his interactions with Elijah, the way he had stepped in to de-escalate a situation that had never been a threat. He had thought he was being professional, but now, he saw it for what it was, a performance, rooted in his own discomfort. He thought about the look Elijah had given him. Not angry but deeply disappointed. It wasn't the kind of look you could shake off. It was the kind of look that stayed with you, whispering in the back of your mind every time you tried to convince yourself you had done nothing wrong. Michael exhaled and stepped out of his car. Today, he decided, he would listen more than he spoke. He owed at least that much to the man who had shown him how much he still had to learn. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Inside the dealership, Alex Harrington addressed the staff in a rare morning meeting. His usual air of confidence was still present, but it had shifted, softened by the events of the day before. Yesterday, he began, his voice steady. We failed. The room was silent. No one shifted. No one whispered. Every face was turned toward Alex. Waiting. We failed because we let assumptions guide us. We failed because we didn't challenge those assumptions. And we failed because we didn't see a customer as a person, only as a reflection of our own biases. Emilia and Michael exchanged glances, their expressions somber. But failure, Alex continued, is an opportunity. It's a chance to learn, to change, to be better. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on each staff member in turn. Today, we start over, not just for Mr. Bennett, but for every person who walks through those doors. Every customer deserves respect, regardless of how they look, what they wear, or what we assume about them. There was a murmur of agreement, hesitant but growing. Alex nodded. This is about more than selling cars. It's about who we are as a team, as a business, as people. If anyone here can't commit to that, I'll understand, but I hope you'll stay. The silence that followed was heavy, but not with resistance. It was the kind of silence that marked a shift, a turning point. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Meanwhile, Elijah sat in his small office across town, his attention divided between the papers on his desk and the emails on his screen. He was a man accustomed to wearing many hats: business owner, mentor, advocate. Yesterday's events had been one chapter in a larger story, one he had been writing for years. He thought about Goldline Autos, about the people who had made him invisible even as they scrutinized his every move. He thought about the subtle weight of their biases, the way it had pressed against him like an invisible hand. And he thought about their faces as he left. Emilia's flushed with shame. Michael's eyes clouded with doubt. Alex's expression resolute but humbled. Elijah knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. It never did, but he also knew that yesterday had planted a seed, a small but vital shift in a place that needed it. Now, it was up to them to nurture it. Blank. Underscore. Blank. Later that afternoon, Elijah received a call from Alex Harrington. Mr. Bennett, Alex said, his voice careful but sincere. I wanted to thank you. For what? Elijah asked, leaning back in his chair. For holding us accountable, Alex replied. For showing us what we needed to see. Elijah was quiet for a moment. Then he said, accountability is a start. What you do next is what matters. Alex nodded, though Elijah couldn't see it. We're working on it, he said, and I hope, in time, we can show you the difference. Elijah's lips curved into a faint smile. I'll be watching. Blank. Underscore. Blank. As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Elijah stepped outside, the cool desert breeze brushing against his skin. He looked up at the sky, its endless expanse a reminder of both the enormity of the world and the smallness of each individual moment. Change was slow, messy, and often unseen, but it was also unstoppable. Elijah had seen it before. In the quiet persistence of those who refused to accept the status quo. In the way truth had a way of seeping into even the most resistant places. And now, as he stood under the fading light, he felt it again, a quiet revolution, unfolding one step at a time.